What do you know about globalization?
Are you recording?
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing.
I have an idea of what it is. I would assume it has something to do with the world because of globalization, and then like an action with the world. That's my best guess.
So globalization is basically the spread of industries and companies internationally.
Globalization is the ability that developing countries have, and they can impose industrial structures on lower income and developing world countries because they have the power to do so.
So I decided to research multinational corporations and how they set up factories in other developing countries, and then the working standards that they set in place in those countries, and how they don't comply with American working standards, but they choose to comply with local working standards, which aren't good enough to protect the workers, to give them what they need, and to provide a healthy life for them. So I asked 5 people if they had any idea about what globalization is, where their products are made, and how they are made, and then I shared my research with them. So throughout this video, you will see their reactions and what they've learned through me talking to them.
Do you know where your products are made and how they're made?
Like, do I read the labels or like what do you mean?
Yeah, like where do you think your products are made?
Most of them are made in China, and then I shop at Target, like the Mosabo or whatever. That stuff comes from Guatemala, and then I know some stuff comes from like India. That's my general guess.
And do you have any like idea of like how they're made? Like, do you think people make them? Do you think machines make them? What do you think?
Seeing as how I know those areas and they're kind of like impoverished areas, so I'm gonna assume they're made by hand by like sweatshops and stuff like that.
I don't know exactly where they're made. I'm not one of those people that like checks the labels, but I am very confident that they are made from like offshooting countries or offshoring countries. Places like Thailand, Southeast Asia is very popular for clothing, so I'm aware that that's the issue.
A lot of them actually do I look at where they're made and where they come from. I'm pretty aware that there's a lot of companies that outsource to third world countries, and I'm aware of some of the issues with that and the companies like not really providing environments that are healthy or safe for these people. So I kind of have like a general idea.
So when I was little, I was having a conversation with my mom, and I asked her like, "Mom, why are all my toys made in China?" And she said, "Tegan, like, what are you talking about? They're not all made in China." And then she was like, "If you can find me 3 toys that were made in China, then like, okay, we can talk about this more." And so I was like, okay. And so I went and got all of my dolls and all of my toys, and I showed her the little tag that said "Made in China," and she said, "Huh, the more you know."
I have some knowledge of where products are made. Usually they are made in developing world countries because the outsourcing of materials and outsourcing of labor is a lot cheaper for companies, especially if they're in the developing world. And labor laws and working conditions aren't suitable for the employees in those countries, which makes it a lot cheaper because we can pay them less. So companies outsource for that reason.
So I really wanted to show the students that I was talking to how disconnected the stockholders and directors of these companies were and are to the people that are creating the products that they then sell. So in an article called "American Corporations, the New Sovereigns," the author states, they being the stockholders and directors, they have no personal contact with the people their decisions affect. Those people are only numbers. The managers don't carry out the decisions themselves and witness the consequences, so they avoid the experiences that might help ensure empathy and restraint. And then to further that research on the disconnect that is happening between people in power and the people that are affected by these standards and by this legislation, I found an article called Continuing Incivility, Labor Rights in a Global Economy. And it's all about how Tom Harkin was a senator in 1992. He sponsored a piece of legislation for Congress that threatens sanctions for countries where child labor was really prevalent. And instead of this like turning the tide, the threat of sanctions caused numerous textile exporters to fire child laborers, which then forced many of these children into lower paying and more dangerous jobs like prostitution and brickmaking. So I was just using this information to show the students that I was talking to that people in power don't always understand the ramifications of the decisions that they're making because this issue is so complex.
Do you know about the working conditions in these areas?
Not really, no.
I don't know exactly, but I assume that they're bad. I mean, they don't really have a lot of government regulation as we do in the West. So I think that they are likely to be poor working conditions with little pay. You can kind of understand and gather the kind of environment that they do work in by understanding that.
I feel like I see on social media a lot, or maybe just through like movies, that conditions aren't super good anywhere, and that like I feel like people just kind of like toss out jokes about it a lot, but I don't really have a lot of research on it or have any like very official facts.
So then I wanted to give the participants some research that would really kind of like help paint the picture of what was going on in these factories and how the workers' conditions were very different than what American standards would allow. So I pulled some information from Iron Rice Bowl to the World's Biggest Sweatshop, Globalization, Institutional Constraints, and the Rights of Chinese Workers. And one of the first things that I found was the China's labor law of 1994, and how it specifies that employees have to work only 40 hours a week, are entitled to 1 day off a week, and have a maximum of 3 overtime hours a day, and should work no more than 36 overtime hours a month. And then the article went on to explain how Walmart Chinese suppliers very much so violate these limitations on working hours, and they have had their employees work a minimum of 11 hours a day for 6 days a week. They refuse to let employees have overtime, and because of that they had worked 160 overtime hours a month. Some other examples I found were Motorola had their factories using toxic chemicals that were getting ingested into the employees' bodies because they didn't have the proper equipment or proper ventilation in their factories. I also told the participants about the dormitories that these Chinese workers are staying in and how they are completely unsanitary and how they try and squeeze way too many people into one room, and they are just not good conditions to live in, especially when you have horrible working conditions. And then finally I told them about especially at Foxconn, how there are some really strict discipline rules that are in place that can dock workers' pay, which is already extremely low. So some of the things are like yawning, sitting on the floor, talking, or walking too quickly. Those are some things that can get employees docked pay.
These do not look like happy people.
So I wanted to give some real life stories to show how detrimental these conditions can be to workers' lives. So from the effects of globalization on Bangladesh's ready-made garment industry, the high cost of cheap clothing, I found the story of the fashion factory fire in Bangladesh that injured 200 and killed at least 112 of its workers. It happened in November of 2012. And then I also told the students about Foxconn. I just briefly mentioned it to them and showed them some images of the suicide nets to give them an idea of what can happen when workers' rights and the working conditions are so poor.
Tell me a little bit about how you feel about the fire story.
Well, like, that just sounds unreasonable. It, like, kind of sounds abusive in a lot of ways. And on, like, a very high level, though, like, you're locking the doors as there's a fire in the building. Like, where's the humanity in that? I think is kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I didn't know about the suicides at Foxconn or the other places and how they put the nets up to try and like combat the issue. That's kind of like a small demonstration of, especially with the reaction, like what kind of things they're trying to do, and to kind of react with something that's reactive rather than preventative. Because if they put the nets up, that's suggesting that they're not going to change anything and that people are going to continue to jump. Or if they don't put the nets up and they change working conditions and try and combat it that way, you can just kind of see like what kind of steps they're trying to do. They're reacting to people committing suicide rather than taking preventative action to stop them from jumping in the first place.
Like, how does it make you feel about the things that you're purchasing?
I think it makes me want to be more aware of where it's coming from and maybe do a little bit more research of the companies specifically, especially like, you know, as I mentioned, like my parents used to do that when they lived in Guatemala. So then, I mean, obviously they didn't have as harsh conditions, but I mean, they were 10, 13 years old making shoes for like you didn't need to do that, but they needed jobs. And to think that like somebody out there might have received what my parents had to make and then just didn't care just as much as now how I don't care about all the things that like other people are going through from my stuff.
I think it's very heartbreaking to see that these bigger corporations that make all this money every year still decide not to abide by American standards, because I think here in America we set the foundation, we set a standard at what we want the other nations to see us as, and as we go into these developing countries, we don't bring the standard with us. We abide by the standard just in order to save money, and I don't think that's fair, especially for workers who have to live in these conditions where instead of fixing the problem, they add a little band-aid to it. I think what you showed me with the suicide nets, it's just that's really bad. It's wrong.
How does hearing all this make you feel about the situation?
It kind of adds on to the knowledge that I kind of already had, but it just gives more evidence to kind of the beliefs that I've already held. I mean, it's really sad, and it's something that angers me, but it also like there's a little bit of like helplessness because I'm not exactly sure like what I can do as an individual. It's a very like upper level issue that would be like a trickle down effect. Like, yeah, I could do something and like I could be an advocate, but like there's only so much I can do, and that's like the most frustrating part. So I think it's like a frustration that I have with like these kinds of issues that happen, because they happen like there's a lot of issues like this that we face, and there's just something that we need to acknowledge.
It's kind of just like infuriating, but then at the same time, I like the terrible side of me is like, these are my products, like why are they being made this way? Like I use Apple a lot, but like what kind of like environment is that people are literally want to kill themselves to get out of working in these places? It seems like just kind of like a really bad trap, but then people also need money, so like, but then how can we fix it? And you talked earlier about like not really being able to pass legislation because of like everything that kind of happens, and like you have higher ups trying to fix problems that are much deeper than that. But yeah, it's kind of just infuriating that other like human beings are being treated that way.
But are you willing to change your purchasing behaviors because of what you just learned? And you can be honest.
Willing to, yes. But long-term wise, because of cost, I would say no.
Slightly, yeah. I personally don't like going to Walmart to begin with. So just understanding more about their practices and what they do as a company just gives me more of a reason not to go spend my money with them. As for purchasing other goods, I will probably look more in depth at what's going on around the world and how they treat the laborers that create these products.
I think a big part of changing my purchasing behavior is knowing like these facts. So like today's the first time that I'm hearing that Apple has these companies where people have nets instead of like fixing working conditions, but like just having a bigger like knowledge of like what's happening behind the scenes and what goes on, I think would make me change.
I probably won't, because for me, like, the guilt doesn't exactly like pour out. Like, I don't have that kind of reaction. Like, obviously it's quite distressing and depressing to see all this, but like, I already knew about this like 5-10 years ago. Like, I'm not going, and I haven't changed, so I really don't see any like short-term change for me.
And finally, I asked them the so what question because I wanted to see what they got from it and how they felt about this issue. So I asked them, why is this important and what do you think should be done?
I know that you said it's a hard issue to solve, but
So the reason that I think it's important is because it's human lives that we're talking about, and it's important that people know about it, because there is such a disconnect, because there's there's a third party. So you have these people that are contracting out to different companies, and if we have these corporations in the US that are contracting out, they separate themselves and they don't realize like who they're affecting, and it's easy for them to just say, oh yeah, well then these other companies should be doing it. Like, yeah, they're in different countries, but these are people, and it's something that we really need to face. And what we can do about it, I mean, be an advocate for it, yes, but trying to like, you talk to people about it, yeah, but I also, like, I'm a little bit of a pessimist, because you can bring it up a bunch of times, but it's only going to stick for so long. But I think that, again, it's something that we need to really speak up about to the corporations, because they're the ones that control it. They can act like they don't, but they do.
Yeah. So I think a lot of these working conditions that we've seen in China, Bangladesh, Thailand, places like that, are very reflective of what we had in the West like 100, 200 years ago. And I think the way that the West managed to deal with these issues was through unionization and through bottom-up reactions. So we saw a lot of riots, we saw workers coming together to forcefully change things. And I think in the West, in Europe and in the US, we've seen that happen in the last centuries. And you've seen conditions improve and workers get paid a decent wage. In China, whether that's possible, I think that's the only way around it. But whether that's possible or not depends on Chinese culture. And how kind of indoctrinated Chinese workers are to the communist governments.
I mean, what can be done? I think, like I said, advocating and then trying to make those changes and letting people know what's going on in the world, because we live in a very American bubble where we don't see everything else going on in the background. And I mean, it's important because you got to think about yourself. I mean, would you want to be in those conditions? If you had children, would you want your children to be in those conditions? And if you had family, would you want to see them in those conditions? It's kind of more like, you got to make it personal in order to make that connection. And I think that includes advocating. It's like, you want to advocate thinking of like, oh, what if that was like my little sister, if she had to do that, and things like that.
I think it's important that people notice, because as people already in a developed country, I understand we do have issues here that we need to deal with, but understanding that the products that we do get from other countries and things that we wear on a daily basis that aren't specifically made here, it just goes to show that we need to see other people's problems too. Like, there always has to be a consciousness about what goes on, not just in your own little circle, but just what goes beyond your own bubble too. I think people can take small steps. I think people can like stop shopping at these larger corporations and invest more money into local mom and pop shops. I think if we limit our spending at these local corporations, and then specifically pick and choose products that we feel have from companies that we feel have supported good practices in different countries, then we will create a change in the practices that companies need to make, because they'll see their profits go down and they'll have to adjust to what the market is saying.
I think this is important because these are human beings that are being treated this way, and that's just not cool for any kind of person to be treated that way, like no matter if they're working in a factory, if they're a billionaire running it from overseas. That's just not cool to treat people like that, and not a fan.
So while I don't think that there is a simple solution to this issue because it's so complex, I do want you to walk away from this video with a couple takeaways just about how you can think about this issue and start to grapple with it. So I think the first one is to educate yourself and educate those around you about the issue. Now you know a little bit more, but you should continue doing research, especially about the products that you use every day or are very brand loyal to. And then I think that advocation is a huge piece. I know Sierra mentioned it in her response video, but I really think that advocating to not just legislators, but also to corporations and saying that this is something that we really care about, and that this is something that we will not stop talking about until it's fixed. And then finally, I think just making yourself more aware of the products that you're using and where they're coming from, and then being willing to maybe make a few small changes here and there when you can with products, and knowing that you are purchasing products that are made in better working conditions than other products. So like Diego said, he doesn't shop at Walmart, he shops at Target because he knows that Target doesn't outsource the same way that Walmart does. So maybe it's changing from going to Walmart to buy things to going to Target to buy things. Just making small changes like that, where you might have to pay a few extra dollars, but you're paying a few extra dollars to know that someone is getting a better life.